Well, thank you, Juliet, and thank you to the organisers for asking me to this conference, because it's inspiring to hear all this different range of papers and ideas, and very refreshing. And I have to say straight off that I'm really thinking about infinity from the point of view of, as I've said in the title, the work that art does, a little bit like the house that Jack built, very much in terms of infinity almost as a cultural material that's used by artists and writers in many different ways. And if there are so many aspects within mathematics itself, then certainly within the culture more generally, it's a term that's both many-faceted, but I think also contested and perhaps even to be fought over. We like to think that art can express big things, you know, big emotions, big ideas, big sentiments. But I guess, you know, I ask myself, is infinity already just too big for our art to deal with, let alone the vertiginous, wonderful feeling created in us non-specialists when you talk about higher infinity or large infinity. In one sense, maybe yes, any contemporary material practice, such as art, by which I mean, you know, to point to things that are made, might be hard put, even maybe disinclined to express the limitless and the boundless, as if that lure of the vast is attached to the kind of old art that believed in and believed it could express the transcendent and the absolute. I'm not sure you'll find too many artists wanting to express the limitless, the absolute, the transcendent in quite those ways. What I'm interested in thinking about today is not, in fact, even what I'm calling an expressive model of art such as that, the kind of art that you can say, what does it express, but more to think about a mechanical question about how art works. And this isn't meant to be either a retreat from the problem of ambitious art, but I feel a way to confront the challenge of art, and in particular of contemporary art, grounded as it is in the conditions under which we live. And in order to do this, I think it's necessary to understand or to stress or to lend emphasis to what art has become and the historical shifts it underwent over the last century, just in order to take account or mark that spot of the radical redefinition of art that we owe to the work of the historical avant-gardes of the early 20th century. So Maria mentioned some of these points herself in her talk earlier. So it follows that I'm not going to be talking about an older idea of a vanishing point in a picture, however complex theories of perspective are and were. There's a sense in which a vanishing point could also be thought of as that point in a picture which holds the picture together. That's not the kind of pictorial mode that I'm interested in here, so much as what I'm calling a serial mode. That is the kind of art that puts into play repetition in order to maximize difference, and where the infinite is certainly an idea that's mobilized because it's always in potentia in some way. But it also very easily collapses into infinite differentiation. Now, the work of the artist who mainly concern me, or I'm focusing on, is the Mexican artist Gabriel Orozco, who's been working since the early 1990s. Some of you will know the work he's just got or has just recently had a show at the Galerie Chantal Croussel here in Paris, as well as a big retrospective at the Pompidou some years ago. The work that Orozco has made alights frequently on problems of scale. And scale within my own field of art history and the humanities has come to be seen in terms of a kind of crisis of scale that we're undergoing at the moment, something that I think many of the mathematicians here perhaps have very interesting insights into that perhaps we can discuss later. But I think Orozco's work in dealing with this idea of vertiginous differences of scale offers perhaps, as many other artists might as well, offers a kind of touch paper with which to think about this fraught relationship between art and infinity. I don't think it's an easy or seamless one. Now, as some of you might know, Gabriel Orozco is an avid reader of Borges and always has been. And work such as this one, which is a photograph called Sand on Table, doesn't simply picture a Borgesian universe, so much as make a photographic image filled with an infinite number of tiny grains of sand. And of course we might think of Borges' Book of Sand, but Orozco also, I think, takes the image elsewhere. It's not a picture of infinity, as much as an acting out of a dynamic, a pyramid emerging from a pile of sand as form itself comes into being in the midst of innumerable small particles of matter. And the tiny particles that are the sand, the grains of sand, mimic the granular surface of the photo and vice versa. It's an artwork. But if it's an image of grains of sand that are perhaps beyond number, perhaps limitless, then it's also, I want to remind ourselves, it's also a deflationary image. It punctures infinity at the same time. After all, you know, what is it? It's just a table. A pyramid on a table on a beach. It's hardly vast. It's a small-scale photograph of little more than, you know, it's a kind of sandcastle. So I think always when we're thinking about an image world that is art, there is this sense in which whatever the aspiration to think infinity, there's something in the work that is countering that, puncturing it, de-sublimating it, to use a term, if you like. Now, Orozco's an artist who frequently refers back to that moment when an abstract language of forms was in the process of emerging over 100 years ago. The first great abstract painters, Mondrian, Malevich, Kandinsky. Remember, abstract art is not new, but old, over 100 years old. And of course, we art historians often refer to this as geometric abstraction, which is, I know, not just hardly adequate, but kind of wrong to what geometry means or what geometers might do. We use that term, a geometric lexicon, a geometric vocabulary, geometric abstraction, simply to evoke this language of triangles, circles, squares. You'll recognize, I'm sure, Malevich laying out the possibilities of his system in 1915 at the 0.10 exhibition. You know, laying out the possibilities and permutations on a series of basic elements. Or, let's see, the utopian planetary rotations of the Russian constructivist Rodchenko. You know, this is, after all, the centenary of the Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917, this month. Here's Rodchenko with his lines, and in this case his circles, or the geometric grids of Mondrian. This is a classic composition from 1921. Now, in relation to our subject, infinity, Gabriele Orozco's habit of revisiting these artists of the historical avant-garde, all of whom can be seen to have a different attitude to the idea of infinity, may, I think, be instructive. But so too I'd like to delve back deeper at certain points during the talk into modernism's preoccupations with infinity, in order to sketch out some of its lure, some of its appeal for artists, as well as to show how fraught that relationship of art to infinity comes to be, and perhaps even some of that anxiety, horror, terror that's been talked about today is part and parcel of its lure and appeal. The poet Paul Valéry proposed, for example, a notion of aesthetic infinity, which approximates to what he called resonance, a vibrating, singing state. That was a key claim of his poetics. And it's a way of describing the experience of art that's not finite, but has the capacity constantly to change, or in his terms, vibrate. So no work of art, according to this view, is actually finite. This isn't quite so free-floating as it sounds, and Theodore Adorno, who wrote a couple of brilliant essays on Valéry, draws our attention to what he saw as most important in the poet's approach, and that is, this is Adorno on Valéry's ability to see works from the inside, in their logic as artifacts, things that have been produced. Now this is a very different way of thinking about the artworks, the way art works, than the idea of an artwork or a picture expressing something out there. This instead, this is still Adorno paraphrasing Valéry, to follow the work of art from the point of view of how it is made. So this idea of a kind of an internal logic, being asked to pay attention to the way it works by paying attention to that systemic unfolding of how it works, is the point that I want to draw attention to at the beginning. You can probably sense the direction I'm going in, at least a direction which isn't necessarily outwards, certainly not outwards to the ideal or towards something we might refer to as the transcendent, and certainly not wishing to make art itself kind of limitless, but to see how the infinitely great and the infinitely small might impact upon one another in terms of, as I say, the way art works. That is, considering, taking into account art's own ways of repeating its own movements, its own scales, both spatial and temporal, that may have analogies in mathematics, but which also have their own distinct and material character. I just wanted to list a few of the possible collisions of thought within modernist art, inevitably very schematically. But if we think of modernist abstraction as a serial project, then the point is not a metaphorics of infinity in each artwork, encapsulated in each artwork, you know, the universe in one painting. But the existence of an almost indefinitely variable sequence whereby any number of different permutations can be played out. Think of Rodchenko's circles or Malevich's geometric elements or Mondrian's coloured grids. You know, Mondrian is playing out that grid, repeating the grid format, and no single painting is ever the same. So, a geometric lexicon, as it's loosely described, turns out less concerned with a rational or a strictly rational logic of geometry, more perhaps concerned with this polymorphic impulse to create any number of different versions of itself. I would want to say that about Mondrian. I'm not showing you the multiple series, but one could, and see within those series how there are breaks and ruptures and so on and so forth, which keeps the motor of repetition and difference moving on. Of course, as I'm sure you know, it's Marcel Duchamp who's much more interested in mathematics than any of the artists of geometric abstraction. His white box, his collections of notes, talks about Poincaré, about infinitude, about the infinite, about infinite and finite series, virtual spaces, hyperspace, and so on and so forth. But also at the same time, Duchamp conjures up Edwin Abbott's Flatlands, you know, the famous Flatlands, a romance of many dimensions, published in 1884. So for every indication of moving forwards towards hyperspace, there's Duchamp also kind of pulling back towards these kinds of archaicisms, pulling us backwards. So one of the things I think is rather important to kind of take account of, perhaps I'll come back to more later, is this sense of a series unfolding but continually looping back irregularly to these earlier moments. So absolutely not simply a forward progression. This is the box, L'Infinitif, as Duchamp called it, and it was produced as an edition in 1967 with the facsimile of the handwritten notes, the little watercolours, the replica receipts, and so on. So it's a composite album of disparate parts, non-sequential. Here it is, reflecting on infinity, but totally contingent and subject to chance combinations and so on. And that, of course, is one of the paradoxes of art. So I just want to give a sense of the wide array of formal possibilities that the mark making can be handmade, or it can be ruler drawn, or found, or nowadays computer generated, or etched, or painted. The point isn't the medium or style, but the procedural process. So rather than a painting as such, or a picture as a unique entity, the point is the sequence of images that unfolds. And I want to insist on this point by way of introduction, if only to make clear how now a contemporary artist like Orozco, but any number of other artists that you will know, works in multiple ways in many different media, using sequences to scramble time as well as space. So this is Orozco's Until You Find Another Yellow Schwalbe from 1995, which I choose simply because I think it's interesting to consider as a serial work of art. It looks quite unlike a series of painting by Mondrian or Malevich, but still I think it can seem to be working serially. It consists of a series of 40 photographs that are shown together in sequence, and 39 of them show 2 motorbikes. One shows a group of 3. And it was made in Berlin. The Schwalbe is local, and the artist drove his Schwalbe around the city looking for other Schwalbes and then photograph them, coupled in this way. And as he said, the viewer watches two motorbikes moving in a parallel sequence to one another, which in theory could go on indefinitely, but remained a sequence that, as Valérie would have insisted, is not so much completed as abandoned. Some of the photographs are even printed back to front, so I don't think I've got any that actually show that, but some of them in the series are printed back to front so that the Schwalbe all face the same way. Now, there's an idea of a game, there's an idea of a procedure, a set of rules that the artist makes for himself. It's a game of chance, but one that is very strictly based in this preset procedure that is then laid open to the vagaries of his life, the street, the city. Now this is simply a grid showing all the possible variations, but actually they're never exhibited like this. They're exhibited shown as a single line of photographs that continues round the walls of a gallery like a panorama. So this also places the viewer physically, us as viewers, physically echoing our movement as we walk along. And the gaps between the photographs, the interruptions, the intervals become important elements within the sequence, experienced not as a whole, but as a series of ongoing parts with no finite end or stop. Now in one sense, this idea of a sequence is already split in two. It's cumulative, but cumulative in the way that so often serial patterns are cumulative, where they end up undoing themselves as they go along. The Schwalbe project is typical of Orozco's project, Orozco's work, insofar as the action that is the first part of the work, the artist driving around Berlin over a period of months, collecting Schwalbes as he goes along, adding to the sequence, obeying the rules of the game that he himself has set in train, but also outwards, gathering up the images of the city as he did so. The local backdrops, the locations, which are contained in the frames of the photographs, they are important too. So rather than a pure sequence then, art gathers what, I always like this phrase of Roland Barthes from his late lectures on the preparation of the novel, what Barthes liked to call circonstance, circumstance, as opposed to reference, circonstance, as in the circumstantial residue of a surroundings. In art historical terms, this whole idea of circonstance and the circumstantial goes against the grain of much of the doxa that attaches to the history of modern painting, where a language of autonomous forms is seen to play out its, almost one could say, manifest destiny as pure abstraction, as if the inside of art could be entirely hermetic and self-sealed, instead of which, of course, in practice, in a series like this, everything that was once seen to be intrinsic to art is now rendered extrinsic, or at least open to the everyday, to the world of contingency. And what I think is interesting and a little disarming is the coexistence of this extreme hermeticism of some modern art. I don't want to deny how hermetic this interesting series and sequences is, but at the very same time, its extreme porosity to the world. The two things obviously seem out of kilter with one another. Of course, they sound as if they're incompatible, except, of course, if we think of something like an interior monologue. We might imagine also that an interior monologue might also involve a complex set of relations to the subject or the self's surroundings, mixtures of concentration and distraction, and so on. Take another work from the early 90s. Again, this is by the same artist, Gabriele Orozco. The light signs that were made for the Gwangju Biennale in Korea, which were made by a sign maker according to a typical configuration of coloured circles that had already come to look like the artist's signature style. And you can see the way in which the language of early abstraction of Rodchenko crossed with Mondrian is almost a configuration, a formal configuration that the artist seems to leapfrog back to in this very distinctive set of formal operations that he works with, the permutations of which he'd drawn out in his Korean notebooks using primary colours. As I've said, these light signs were reminiscent of the beginnings of abstract painting, in particular early abstraction, using the colours of Mondrian. But they also invoke not perhaps the success of that language of abstraction, but what's often talked about as the failure of that earlier utopian vision of the historical avant-gardes who believed that transformations in art could change consciousness. In many ways, the failure of the scale of that vision had been reduced now to 12 notebook pages, the remnants of a sketchbook, if you like, that trace his own itineraries as an artist, his own personal geographies. So, an unfolding series is also a series of leftover traces of a process. And in the paintings that Orozco began to make almost 10 years later, in the early 2000s, 2004, he set a similar procedure in motion. He began at the centre of a square. He works outwards, changing the colourways as if he were making the knights move in chess. So others will know better, but sometimes two forward, one across. The Duchamp reference is clear. The artist had also been a chess champion as a boy. But as he describes it, the centre is destroyed in the process. So a procedure is set in train that can play out variation chromatically and structurally. Before I say a little bit more about that, I want to digress for a moment to just say a little more about what feels to me like certainly within the history of modern art, as an almost absurdly pneumatic tendency to veer from the vast to the small to the vast. You know, especially in such sudden contractions of the infinitely possible to a finite number of pages in a notebook. It's as if these veerings between the vast and the tiny is something that offer an in-between terrain that artists like to work with. And of course, Duchamp had always been interested in the work of the great writer and poet Raymond Roussel, whose book of poems, New Impressions of Africa, had contained these illustrations. Roussel, the great modernist writer, experimental writer, but also the little known prototype and executor of his own kind of ready-made. Roussel had written anonymously to the engraving Henri Achille Zo, simply with the verbal instructions. And the verbal instructions of the one on the right is the image that I'm concerned with in New Impressions of Africa. So this is the direction to the engraver, who was actually an admirer of the poet Roussel, and afterwards was kind of disappointed that he hadn't actually known that it was Roussel that he was making these illustrations for. But Roussel makes this directive a section of starry sky without any earthly landscape, as if seen from some vantage point in space and giving the impression of infinity. Now, the impression of infinity is obviously a very small engraving in a book, which I show you not so much as a representation of infinity. A starry sky is almost a cliche rendering of it, isn't it? So much as to indicate the way in which scale and disproportion is at stake in representation. Now, Roussel is sometimes called Marcel Proust's dark twin, and he has this alarming capacity to range from the infinitely large to the infinitely small. And another of my favourite examples of Roussel's extraordinary imagination is a poem he wrote called La Sauce, the Sauce. Now, this is the longest poem that he wrote describing the tiny label on a bottle of mineral water. So the poem is almost like a kind of infinite regress into itself, a mise en abîme, if you like. The poet is sitting in a spa, looking at a label which expands exponentially into words. And Roussel's poem runs to 50 pages. As I said, it's called La Sauce. It describes, as I said, the label on a bottle of mineral water. We're thinking French Alps, circa 1900 here. A tiny label, that is, that depicts an image of a thermal spa, possibly Aix-les-Bains. The building, the waters, a picturesque landscape, fully peopled with all the requisite symbols, you know, a nude female figure, an amphora of water, and so on and so forth. So a universe of signs in that excess of words. As you can imagine, far too much and far too many words to be possibly containable within that small rectangle of paper. That is the modern trope par excellence, the printed label, like the photograph, a modern serial form, historically embedded in commerce. And however crammed the label was with letters, however fine the line engraving, such fantasies as Roussel's, such projections as Roussel's, always exceed the frame, that always fail to contain them. And this isn't it, of course, it isn't the actual label, but I'm sure we all have an image of what such labels might look like. So, La Sauce means source, a pure origin, a watery beginning, or spa, a social space of renewal and health. And the image on the bottle is a miniature version of the place where Roussel, or his fictional protagonist, sits at that restaurant table. So in some ways, there's something exorbitant, extravagant, that's what I'm trying to say, about this disproportion. It's almost as if this is like a lens. Something where this miniature image inflates pneumatically in the imagination. So where's the sense of scale in that? Where's the sense of what infinity might mean in that? So if we might return to Orozco, we can see he's tapping into a vital trajectory, I think, within modernism itself, in a way that's historically embedded rather than universal and absolute. This capacity of infinities to multiply both inwards and outwards, spatially and temporally, presents us with a critical problem of scale, one that's arguably particularly pressing right now as the infinite immensity of virtual and digitized spaces and the seductions and terrors that attach to them seem to engulf us. So it's these multiple serialities that I'm interested in that can't be reduced to one but spread out into across a wide field. These small intricate series spread out, for example, across the items on a supermarket shelf in a recent project that Orozco made in Mexico City, where he set up a fully operating supermarket, the ubiquitous OXXO, in his gallery. So another kind of mise en abîme, if you like, a supermarket inside a gallery, creating an elaborate game of overlapping series between the economies of art, of the supermarket, of the art market. So let's think about the relation between series and dispersal, the leftovers from the project, the series of works that he intervenes on. I hope you can see the labels in these images are like tiny collage, like little Schwitter's collages that function like miniature versions turned in on themselves, or they act as the artist's own brand. In some ways, the fact that it's not so much the literal size, so much as the lurching between the infinitesimally small difference, the joint between a coloured sticker and a ready-made logo or brand image, that sets these vast circuits of global circulation in train. So I'm trying to insist on the way seriality plays out in the everyday, rooted in a history of commodity culture, of exchange, because I think art operates, at least Orozco's art operates in a precarious object world. Art plays fast and loose with abstract systems in a generally impure rather than pure way. Maybe it's art's job to be a wrecking game on the very abstract realms that it inhabits, that we all inhabit. Not least as we think of ourselves as bodies walking around a space along a suite of photographs or pictures or encounters at intervals on a supermarket shelf. Now, when he began these paintings in 2004, he surprised pretty much everyone because he was a conceptual artist who didn't make paintings. But I think in some ways, just to show you briefly the kind of procedure that's set in train through, as I mentioned, the night's move. In one sense, he worked through all the possible permutations on a computer to work out the possible variants using these four colorways, blue, white, red, and gold. So that basic skeletal structure of circles, halves, and quadrants transforms itself into different versions of itself. And in 2006, he showed all the possibilities, 672 digital prints at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. This is a small part of it. This is rather different, I think, from something like Yo-Yo Kusama's infinity rooms that created endless reflections with lights and mirrors in dark spaces, but also as you can see, affects a kind of dissolution that threatens to overwhelm and threaten the boundary of the subject. On the contrary, I think Orozco's insistence on art's hermetic sense of itself as series, as procedure, intensifies some of this problematic rather than dramatizes atmosphere. Pascal wrote in his famous Pensée, "When I consider the short duration of my life swallowed up in the eternity before and after, the little space which I fill and even can see, engulfed in the infinite immensity of spaces of which I am ignorant and which know me not, I am frightened." The little space which I fill in relation to that infinite immensity, art, it seems to me, occupies a ground between that asks questions about the little space that I am in, as well as what it means to think about what infinity means to us now. Thank you.